The third week of November, an hour before the betrothal dinner, the Duchess of Maperton knelt on the cold flags of the still room and took a scullery girl's chapped hands in both of her own. A duchess did not kneel. A duchess did not weep into the apron of a girl who scrubbed her copper pans, and she did not press a strand of pearls into that girl's raw fingers, and she did not say, in a voice gone thin as paper held to a flame, that she could not walk into that dining room tonight, that she would die before she sat at the head of that table, that she would give anything, if Effie would put on her gown and take her place. Above them, the great house was loud with arrival. Somewhere, a violin being tuned, one string at a time, each note climbing and stopping short of true. Here in the still room, far below, all of it, a young woman in white was kneeling to a young woman in gray, and the gray was the one with steady hands. What Effie understood in that moment was very little. What she felt was the whole weight of the house pressing down through the floors above her, the pearls already warming in her palm, and the strange certainty that whatever she answered now, nothing in her small life would ever be folded back to the shape it had held an hour before. She helped the Duchess up off the floor, because the floor was cold and the Duchess was shaking, and that was the only thing Effie's hands knew how to do. To understand how a kitchen girl came to be kneeling, face to face with the highest lady in 3 counties, go back 6 months to the wet spring morning. Effie Sangwell arrived at Maperton Hall with everything she owned, tied in a square of sacking, and a character reference honest in every line and worth nothing at all. She had not always been a servant. Her father had been the curate at a poor living near the coast, a gentle scholar who taught his only daughter to read Latin before she could properly sew, and who died in his 49th winter owing more than he had ever earned. There was a girl of 19 with a good hand, a quiet voice, and not a single relation who would own her. Effie took it without complaint, because her father had taught her that a person's worth is not the same thing as a person's station, and that the second can be stripped away in an afternoon, while the first cannot be touched by any hand on earth. At Maperton she was the lowest of the kitchen, which is the lowest of the house. She rose at 4, blacked the grates, carried coal, scoured the great copper pans with sand and lye, until her knuckles cracked and bled. Mrs. Sader Crewdson, the housekeeper, a square, weathered woman who missed nothing, watched the new girl a fortnight and pronounced her quick, clean, and far too well-spoken for her own good. To the kitchen, Effie was the curate's brat come down in the world, and the room had decided she gave herself airs, and the room did not forgive airs. She did not give herself airs. Even so, she could not hide what she was, because once in her first month, the undercook needed a receipt copied from a stained old book she could not make out, and Effie read it aloud without thinking, easy as breathing. After that, they knew. A scullery girl who read like a gentlewoman was a thing the house did not have a shelf for, and so they set her above herself, and there she stayed. Maperton Hall was a great gray pile of a place, 140 years old, set in 800 acres of park and farm, with a long gravel drive lined in bare November limes, and a south front of 40 windows that caught the low sun like beaten pewter. It belonged to Cyrus, the Duke of Maperton, a man Effie had seen perhaps 4 times across 6 months, and never once up close, often from home. The house, everyone said, below stairs, was not a happy one, though no one would say why, and the things no one will say are the load-bearing walls of a great house. There was a duchess. This Effie knew the way the kitchen, knew the weather, as a fact that governed everything and was discussed by no one. She had come to the house 2 years before, a bride of 20, and within a season she had stopped coming down. She kept to the east apartments. The county had married her in expectation of a brilliant young hostess, and been given instead a closed door and a doctor's gig in the drive twice a week, and it had drawn its own conclusions and shared them freely. The Duchess was delicate. The Duchess was mad. The Duchess was proud past bearing, and would not lower herself to her neighbors. What no one below stairs knew was the name of the woman who governed the closed door from the other side. The Duke's mother had not quit Maperton when her son married. The Dowager Duchess Eudocia kept her rooms in the West Wing and her hand on every thread of the household, and the young wife who could not manage her own dinner table had become by slow and bloodless degrees a guest in her own house. The Dowager was 61, upright as a fire iron, with a memory for slights that ran back 40 years, and a fixed conviction that the order of the world was the order God intended, and that her business on earth was to defend it. She was not cruel in the way the kitchen imagined cruelty. She was something worse and quieter. She was certain. Effie came to the Duchess by accident in her 3rd month. On a night, the upper servants were abed with a putrid cold and a posset was wanted in the east apartments, and no one else was standing. Mrs. Crewdson weighed the scullery girl and handed her the tray. Up the back stair, through a door Effie had never been permitted to touch. In a high cold room with the fire let go to embers, sat the most frightened young woman Effie had ever seen. The Duchess of Maperton was beautiful in the way of something kept too long out of the light, pale and fine and faintly translucent, with great dark eyes that went to the door as though she expected it always to bring a blow. She was Effie's own age. Near enough, wrapped in 3 shawls, and still shivering. On the table beside her lay an open book, face down to keep her place, and Effie, setting down the tray, read the title without meaning to, and said before she could stop her foolish tongue, that it was a good translation, the Cowper, far better than the other one. The Duchess, who had not been spoken to as a person in longer than she could count, looked up at a kitchen girl in a coarse apron, and began, very quietly, to cry. That was the beginning. After that night, Effie carried the trays, and Mrs. Pora Crewdson permitted it, because the Duchess ate when Effie brought the food, and did not when others did. Twice a week, then 3 times, Effie climbed the back stair. She read aloud. The Cowper and then the others, her father's whole education, spilling at last out of a scullery girl into the one ear in that house that wanted it. The Duchess, whose name among her intimates had once been Winnell, and was now nothing at all, came slowly, over the bare November weeks, back toward the surface of her own life. She told Effie things in pieces. How she had come to Maperton, a happy girl who liked to dance, and could not now remember the steps. How the Dowager had met her at the door on her wedding day, and said pleasantly that the house had got on for 40 years without help, and would manage 40 more. How every menu was countermanded, every servant she favored dismissed within the month, every letter read first by a maid who answered to the West Wing. How her husband loved her, in the helpless way of a man who cannot see the water rising. How a single dinner, 2 springs past, had broken something in her that had not mended since. She had risen to propose a toast before 40 guests, forgotten the words, and stood mute and burning while the Dowager smoothly finished it for her, and the small kind laughter had followed her from the room. She had not sat at the head of a table since. Her hands shook at the thought of it. Effie listened, and built the fire, and did not pity her, because pity was a thing you did to a person from above, and Effie had no above to do it from. She gave the Duchess instead the only thing she had, attention, exact and unflinching. The attention of a person who has lost everything and learned thereby that another's pain is real. Slowly the room grew warmer than its fire. The Dowager noticed. She noticed the kitchen girl absent from the scullery of an evening, the Duchess asking after a volume from the library, eating a second helping, once even laughing where laughter could be heard through a door. She sent for Mrs. Crewdson and asked lightly who was carrying to the east apartments now, and was told, and said nothing, and let a week pass, which was how the Dowager did things. Then she had Effie brought to the West Wing. It was the first time Effie stood in the same room as real power, and felt it without the floors between them. The Dowager sat very straight by a good fire, a small dog asleep on a cushion, and looked at the scullery girl the way a woman looks at a stain she has not yet decided how to remove. She asked Effie's name, her parentage, where she had learned to read, and listened with a pleasant, terrible patience. Then she said in a voice like cool water over smooth stone, that it was a sad thing when a person forgot her place, that the kindest service one could do such a person was to remind her of it before she rose too high and had the further to fall, and that kitchen girls who imagined themselves companions to duchesses generally ended in the road. Effie went back down the stair. She did not tell the Duchess. She built the fire and read the Cowper and said nothing, because there was nothing to be done, and because she had learned at her father's deathbed that some weights you simply carry. A thread had been drawn taut in the house now, and the dowager was a woman who pulled taut threads to see what would come loose. What came loose that December was a betrothal. The Duke had a cousin, a personable idle man of 30, whom the dowager had decided to advance, and an heiress in view, a Miss Phaedra Lovage, lately come from the West Indies trade with a fortune in sugar and a hunger for a coronet, who would do very well for him if the thing could be managed with sufficient grandeur. Grandeur at Maperton meant a great dinner, the first in 2 years, 40 covers in the long dining room, the county invited, the family displayed. At the head of the family table, the Duchess of Maperton. It was not a thing that could be done without her. A betrothal dinner with the lady of the house above stairs behind a locked door was a confession, and the dowager did not make confessions. The Duchess would preside. The dowager arranged it as a kindness and meant it as a test, and everyone in the East Apartments understood which it was. Effie watched the Duchess come apart over that week the way ice comes apart over a thaw, silently and all at once. She practiced, in the cold of her own room, the carrying of a dish from the door to the table, and her hands shook so that the dish rattled, and she wept and tried again. Nothing helped. The Duchess had been told her whole married life that she was nothing, and now she was asked to be everything for one evening before 40 pairs of eyes, with the dowager at her elbow, waiting patiently for her to fail. On the evening itself, an hour before the guests sat down, in the still room, where the candied peel was kept and no one would think to look, the Duchess of Maperton knelt on the cold flags and begged a scullery girl to take her place. Effie said no. Let that be plain. She said no, for a long quarter of an hour, kneeling there with the pearls warming in her hand, because the thing was madness, because she would be discovered in a sentence, because a kitchen girl in a duchess's gown was a hanging matter dressed up as a comedy. The Duchess wept and said it could be done, that the county did not know her face, that she had not shown it in 2 years, that the candles would be low. And no one looked at the lady of the house except to find her wanting, that Effie need only sit and incline her head, and let the dowager run the table as she always did just one evening, so that she might keep the small life she had clawed back. Then she said the thing that turned the key. She said that Effie was the only person in the world she trusted, and that she had no right to ask, and that she was asking. Effie thought of her father, who had taught her that worth and station were not the same. She thought of the smiling dowager. She thought last and longest of the woman kneeling in front of her, who had been kind in a house that had given her no reason to be kind, asking not to be saved, but only to be spared. Effie, who had nothing left to lose that the world had not already taken, made the worst decision of her life, and the best, and said that she would do it. On one condition, that the moment the cloth was drawn and the ladies withdrew, the Duchess would resume her own place and never ask such a thing again. The Duchess agreed to everything. They had 40 minutes. What followed was a transformation worked by 2 pairs of trembling hands and a great deal of pinned silk. They were near enough of an age and a height, and Effie's hands, when the gown was on, stopped shaking before the Duchess's did. She caught sight of herself in the dim, still-room glass, and did not know the woman there. White silk and the pearls, cold at her throat and her dark hair dressed high, and for one breath she understood the whole of the Duchess's terror, the sensation of being looked at by everyone and seen by no one. Then she lifted her chin, because her father had carried his own ruin into 100 drawing-rooms with his chin up. And she had his. She went up the great stair as the gong sounded. The long dining room at Maperton Hall blazed with 200 candles down a table dressed in the family silver, and 40 members of the county rose as the lady of the house came in, and Effie, scullery maid, walked the length of it to the high chair at the head, and sat in the Duchess of Maperton's place. The dowager was already seated at the foot, magnificent in grey and diamonds, and her eyes came up the table and rested there a moment, with a flicker Effie could not read and would spend the rest of the evening trying to. To her right the Duke took his seat, kind absent Cyrus, who glanced at his wife and away and back, and a small line appeared between his brows and stayed. Down the table, 2 places along on the left, sat a man Effie had never seen, looking at her with an attention so complete that she felt it on her skin like a change in the weather. He was perhaps 34, tall, with the kind of stillness that fills a room more than motion does. Dark hair, plainly dressed against the powdered fashion of the older men, a hard, clean jaw and grey eyes, set deep, a navy coat without ornament, and a white cravat tied once and let alone. He did not look away when she caught him looking, which decorum required. He went on regarding her as though she were a line in a book that did not parse, and he meant to read it until it did. Effie learned his name before the soup was cleared. He was Edric, the Earl of Wendover, the Duke's nearest neighbor and oldest friend, lately back to the county after 3 years no one quite explained. And he had, the lady on his left, murmured behind her fan, not been seen at a dinner table since his wife died. The dinner was an ordeal beyond Effie's worst imagining, and she got through it by silence and exact attention. The dowager ran the table as promised, steered every topic, gave the impostor nothing to do but incline her head, and the county, finding the Duchess recovered enough to sit but still pale and silent, nodded to one another and let her be. It was working. Then midway through the second course, Miss Phaedra Lovage, the bright, hard heiress whose betrothal this was, leaned down the table and asked the Duchess, with the carrying voice of a person who likes a room to attend her, whether her grace did not find the Cowper a sad cold version of the Greek, whether she had not always preferred the older translation, the bolder one. It was the kind of small testing dart of culture the county threw at a duchess, expecting a murmur and a smile. Effie, who had read both translations aloud in a cold room 100 times, who knew the older one for a vigorous, wrong-headed thing that mistook half its tenses, forgot for one fatal instant that she was a chair the room required to be filled, and answered. She said that the older translation had fire, but no truth, that it galloped where the Greek walked, and that a cold true thing was worth more than a warm false one, in a book as in a life. The table went quiet. It was a scholar's judgment delivered plain, and 40 people who had spent 2 years believing the Duchess of Maperton a delicate, near-witless invalid looked up the table at a woman they did not recognize. Down the table the Earl set down his glass very slowly. At the foot, the dowager's hand closed on the stem of hers. In the half-second, before the talk rushed back to cover the silence, Effie felt the floor of the whole evening tilt, because she had been seen, truly seen, by the one pair of grey eyes that had been looking for something to see, and there was no calling it back. The dowager was not a woman who failed to notice a wrong note. She had run that house for 40 years, on the strength of noticing, and she had been watching the head of her table all evening, with the attention of a woman who has staked an evening on a daughter-in-law's collapse and been cheated of it. The Duchess, she knew, did not sit straight, did not meet a guest's eye, most certainly did not deliver a judgment on the Greek in a voice without a tremor in it. The dowager, hearing that voice, knew with cold certainty that the woman in her son's wife's chair was not her son's wife. She said nothing. She finished her course, complimented the heiress, turned the talk to the hunting, and let the evening close over the moment like water over a stone. Behind the smooth gray front, her mind had begun to work toward a proof, slow and public and final, that would let her cast the impostor and the daughter-in-law both into the road together. At a stroke, the dowager, who read every letter that came into Maperton, already half knew. When the cloth was drawn and the ladies rose to withdraw, Effie kept her bargain to the letter. In the press of skirts at the door she slipped to the side passage, and the real Duchess was there in grey in the dark, and in 90 seconds, behind a screen, white silk became grey wool, and the pearls came off a scullery girl's throat. The Duchess, pale and shaking but upright, went in to her own guests, late and breathless, and explained away as a turn of faintness, and Effie went down the back stair to the kitchen with the print of the pearls still cold on her skin. She told herself, scrubbing the late pots, that it was finished. It was not finished. Upstairs, the Earl of Wendover stood by the fire and watched the Duchess of Maperton pour the tea, and saw at once that this was a different woman, fairer, frailer, with a tremor in her hand, and none of that cold, quick fire. And a man less observant would have thought himself mistaken in the candlelight. The Earl was not less observant. He had spent 3 years learning the difference between a face and the truth behind it. He knew he had not been mistaken, and he said nothing to anyone, and he began quietly to watch. What the Earl carried, and what no one at Maperton knew, was a grief of his own, with the same shape as the Duchess's. He had married, 4 years past, a clever, spirited girl whom his own family had judged beneath him the daughter of a physician. And he had watched the county close its cool, grey ranks against her, and he had been too slow and too proud to see how the slights wore her down. And she had sickened and died in her second winter with the wound of never having been welcomed, still open in her. He had carried since then a single fixed conviction, that the world is criminally careless of worth. It has not been taught to recognize that he had failed once to defend such worth in time, and would not fail so again. At a betrothal dinner he had not wanted to attend, he had looked up the table and seen a woman in a duchess's chair speak a true cold sentence in a frightened, false room, and something in him that had been 3 years still had woken. He found her, 4 days later, walking in the kitchen garden at the hour the scraps went out. He saw a kitchen girl carry the pail to the midden, dark-haired, plain-aproned, her chin up, in a way no kitchen girl's chin had any business being, and he knew her at once. Effie, looking up to find the Earl among the bare, espaliered pears regarding her with grave grey attention, went white, and then very still, and waited for the road. He did not denounce her. He asked her name, gently. And Effie, who had decided in the space of a breath that lying to those eyes was beneath her, told him, "Effie sang well. Curate's daughter. Scullery maid." He listened to the whole of it among the pear trees in the cold. And when she had done, he said, his voice low, that her judgment on the cowper had been the only true thing said at that table in 2 years, that he knew a frightened woman protecting another frightened woman when he saw it, and that she need not be afraid of him. Then he was gone, and Effie stood with the pail in her raw hands and understood that she was now in far deeper than a single dinner, and that the deepest part of it had grey eyes. He came again, on the thin excuses a great man can always find, and each time he found his way to the cold edges of the house where Effie worked. They spoke in stolen quarter hours among the pears, and once in the still room, and once in the great library where he had been left to wait and she had been sent with coals. He learned the whole of it, the locked door and the reed letters, the countermanded menus and the smiling dowager, the long, slow strangling of a young wife. Effie learned him, the dead, clever wife, the failure he could not set down. They did not touch. He kept a careful arm's length, and she kept to her side, of whatever room they were in. And the not touching became a thing more present than touch, a held breath drawn out for weeks. And both of them knew it, and neither named it. In the library, the last week, before everything broke, he asked her why she had said yes that night, why a girl with everything to lose had put on another woman's gown for a duchess who could not lift a finger to protect her in return. Effie, with the cold light coming grey through the tall windows and the leather book spines rising into the dark above them, said that her father had told her worth was not the same as station, that she had spent 6 months in a house that believed the opposite with all its heart, and that when one frightened woman knelt to another and asked to be spared, she would rather be hanged for believing her father than live safe believing the dowager. The Earl of Wendover looked at her a long moment in the grey light, and his hard jaw was not hard at all, and he said her given name, Euphemia, the first time in her whole service that anyone in that house had said it as though it were a thing of value, and the room was very quiet, and neither of them moved. The dowager had not been idle. While the Earl was learning Effie, the dowager was hunting her, and the dowager hunted to kill. She had her proof within the week by having a maid follow the kitchen girl and a groom ride to the coast and the curate's old parish, and she learned the name Sangwell and the dead father and the debts. And she built of these honest facts a dishonest weapon. She did not mean merely to dismiss a scullery maid. A dismissed maid vanished, and the disorder remained. She meant to expose the whole of it before the assembled county, to prove the Duchess so disordered that she had seated a thieving drab in her own chair, and that the only remedy was for the Duke to set his wife aside into the care of physicians and for his mother to take up the keys for good. To make it sure, the Dowager did two things, both quietly, both in the careful weeks of December. She had a letter forged in a clerk's hand, a false character from a house that did not exist, naming Euphemia Sangwell, a thief turned out for stealing silver. And she invited to Mapperton's Christmas dinner the county magistrate, a stickler for the law, and a friend to no impostor, so that when the creature was unmasked, there would be an officer of the crown at the table to give the unmasking the weight of justice, and not merely of family quarrel. She made one error, the error of being so certain of the order of the world that she could not imagine a person inside it choosing against their own advantage. She told the rival, Miss Lovage, the half of the plan that suited her, and set her to draw the false Duchess out again before the magistrate. Miss Lovage, who was sharp and greedy but not in the end cruel, did as she was bid at the Christmas table, and asked Effie a leading question across the candlelight, and watched Effie's face, and saw there not a scheming drab but a frightened girl protecting someone. The same look the heiress had worn herself once, before the sugar money made her safe. And something in her balked. The Dowager had armed her weapon and aimed it. She had not reckoned that it might turn. Word of the hunt reached Effie before the dinner did, by the surest road in any great house, a frightened servant's whisper. A laundry maid had carried the forged letter from the West Wing and seen the name on it. A footman had heard the magistrate's invitation read. Effie understood in one cold rush the whole machine built around her, and that it was not aimed at her at all but through her at the Duchess, and that if she ran tonight, the trap would still close, because the Dowager would simply produce the forged letter and the magistrate and tell the story she meant to tell, with or without the drab to display. There was no door out that did not lead through the Duchess. Effie went up the back stair one last time to warn her, and found her already worse than warned, found her sitting in the cold with the firelight on her ruined face, because the Dowager, sure now of her ground, had gone to the young Duchess that afternoon and told her, smiling, exactly what was coming. And the Duchess of Mapperton had heard her own destruction, laid out course by course, and had not the strength left to stand up under it. That was the dark of it, the lowest hour. The two women sat together in the cold east apartment, on Christmas Eve, with the great house, bright and loud below them, and there was no plan, no rescue, no power either of them held. The Duchess said in a voice gone flat and final that Effie must run tonight, must take the back lane to the coast and go, that she would not have Effie hang for her, that the Dowager would win because the Dowager always won. Effie, looking at the broken woman in the firelight, felt the old grief rise in her. Her father's ruin, her own long fall, the smiling certainty that worth could be stripped away in an afternoon, and felt under it, harder and colder and steadier, the one thing her father had left her that no one had ever managed to take. She said no. She said she would not run. She said it quietly, with her chin up. And she meant it. Effie had understood the one thing the Dowager in all her certainty had not. The whole trap rested on a lie, the forged letter, the false character, the name of a house that did not exist. A lie, Effie's father had taught her, is a true thing's shadow and falls the moment a true thing is brought into the room. The Dowager had a forged character. Effie had the real one, honest in every line, the worthless honest reference she had carried to Mapperton in a square of sacking 6 months before, and kept because it was the last thing in the world that bore her father's parish seal. And Effie had something the Dowager could not forge and could not buy. She had a witness, a man who had watched a true cold sentence cross a false warm table, and known it for what it was, and decided in his 3 years' still grief that he would not stand by silent a second time while the world ground down a worth it was too lazy to see. Effie went to the Earl of Wendover that night. She did not send. She went herself, on foot, 3 miles of frozen lane in the dark, and stood at his door in her servant's cloak with her father's reference in her hand, and told him the whole of the Dowager's machine, the forged letter, the magistrate, the trap set to spring on the Duchess through her. The Earl, who had been waiting 4 years for exactly this and had not known it, heard her out by his own fire and was silent, and then said, his voice level, that the Dowager had made one mistake. She had invited a magistrate to her table, to give a lie the weight of the law, and a man of law weighs evidence. He would be at that dinner. The whole county had been invited. He would prove the character false, because a forged paper naming a house that never stood could be exposed by any man with the patience to ask after it, and the Earl had patience. And he would stand witness himself. He told Effie to go back, and to play the part one last time, openly, with him in the room, and to trust him. Effie, who had not trusted a soul above her station since her father died, looked into the gray eyes that had seen her when no one else in the world had bothered, and trusted him. The Christmas dinner at Mapperton Hall was the grandest the county had seen in a generation, 60 covers, and at the head of the table, in white silk and the cold pearls, sat a woman, the county still believed to be the Duchess of Mapperton. The Dowager sat at the foot in gray and diamonds with the magistrate at her right hand, content, because the machine was built and nothing remained but to spring it. Then, with the smooth, pleasant, terrible patience of a lifetime, the Dowager set down her glass and addressed the table, and said that before the company went further she had a painful duty, that a grave fraud had been worked under that very roof, that the woman seated in her son's wife's chair was no Duchess at all, but a kitchen drab, a thief, turned off from her last place for stealing silver, and she had the proof of it in her hand. She produced the forged letter. The table froze. 60 faces turned, and the magistrate half rose, and the Duke went gray, and the Dowager held out the false character to the officer of the crown with the small smile of a woman watching her certainty become law. The dismissive label had been spoken at last in its third and final voicing, no longer a private aside nor a guest's idle dart, but a public accusation flung the length of a candlelit room before a magistrate, and it hung in the silence waiting to be made true. Then the Earl rose, without haste, in his navy coat, and the room turned to him, because rooms turned to him, and he said, his voice level and carrying, that he begged the magistrate's pardon, but that he too had a witness's right, and would beg the company to weigh 2 things before any name was given to the law. The letter the Dowager held named a house, he said, and he had taken the trouble to ask after that house, and there was no such house, had never been, and a paper that swore to a place that did not exist was not a character but a forgery, and he would say so to any bench in England. The magistrate took the letter. The magistrate read it. The magistrate's careful legal face began to close against the woman who had handed it to him. The Earl went on, into the gathering silence, and said the second thing, the harder thing, the true cold thing, brought at last into the room. The woman at the head of the table, he said, was indeed not the Duchess of Mapperton. She was no thief, the Earl said, and no drab. She was Euphemia Sangwell, a clergyman's daughter fallen by no fault of her own into service. And she sat in that chair tonight because the true Duchess of Mapperton, a young woman broken and silenced under that very roof for 2 years by the woman now playing her champion, had been too terrified to face a table she had every right to, and had begged the one person in the house who had ever shown her kindness to spare her one evening's public shame. That was the whole of the fraud, the Earl said, a frightened woman protected by a kind one. He had witnessed it himself and would swear to it. And if the law wished to know which person at that table had this past month forged a letter, suborned a witness, and laid a trap to cast a sick young wife into a madhouse and seize her house, the law had only to look down the table to its hostess. The room did not erupt. That was the mercy of it, and the weight of it. The room went very still, and into the stillness the magistrate turned, slowly, from the woman at the head of the table to the woman at the foot, and the 60 faces of the county turned with him, and the dowager who had run that house and that county on the strength of never once being doubted, felt the whole grey edifice of her certainty tilt and begin, silently, to fall. She rose. She said the woman was lying. She said the Earl was bewitched. She fragmented, her smooth sentences breaking into shorter ones and the shorter ones into single words. And the more she protested, the more plainly. The table saw what the Earl had laid before it, the forged paper in the magistrate's hand, the long, quiet cruelty suddenly lit from a new angle and showing its true shape. Then the door at the side of the long room opened, and the real Duchess of Maperton came in. She came in grey and pale and shaking, the true wife, and walked the length of the room that had broken her 2 springs before, past 60 staring faces, to stand beside the kitchen girl who had taken her place, and she put her shaking hand on Effie's shoulder, and found, at last in front of everyone, the words she had stood mute. Without 2 years before, she said that every word the Earl had spoken was true, that the fraud was hers, and Effie's only sin was loving-kindness, that the woman who had ruled that house in her name had this month tried to have her shut away and her house taken, and that she would not be shut away, and that she was the Duchess of Maperton, and that she was home. Then she turned to her husband. The Duke of Maperton, kind absent Cyrus, who had been blind so long because he was so seldom in the house, looked at his wife standing upright in the room that had broken her, and looked at his mother fragmenting at the foot of the table, and the line between his brows became something final, and he rose and crossed to his wife, front of the magistrate and the county and his mother, that the Duchess of Maperton would keep her keys, and her house, and her chair, and that the dowager would remove to the dower house at Penavon by the new year. The dowager was not destroyed. The certainty was simply quietly removed from under her, and she was made to stand in the world as a woman like any other, accountable, doubted, displaced." Unquote. The magistrate did not take her up. The family was spared that, and the forged letter went into the fire by the Duke's own hand, rather than into the record, because a great house does not hang its grandmother and does not need to. She went to Penavon in the new year. It was enough. Some at the table, watching her go grey and silent from the room she had ruled, understood for the first time that her vigilance had been a cruelty wearing the mask of care, and that they had believed her for 40 years, because believing her had cost them nothing, and a few of them were ashamed. Effie stood through all of it in white silk that was not hers, in the chair that was not hers, and when it was over, she gave the chair back. She rose and drew off the cold pearls, and laid them in the true Duchess's hands, and would have gone down the back stair to the kitchen, because that was where a scullery girl belonged when the play was done. The Earl did not let her reach the stair. He crossed the length of the long room a second time in front of the county that had just learned her name, and took her raw, chapped hand in his, openly, where every soul in 3 counties could see it, and he said her given name again, Euphemia, and then said the short, true thing he had carried to that table to say, the thing he had failed to say in time once and would not fail to say again. He said, his voice low and level, and meant for the whole room to hear, that he would be honored if she would be his wife. A name claimed, an offer made, in the same room where the hierarchy had just rendered its verdict, and irrevocable. The county gasped, the Duchess wept. And Effie, curate's daughter, scullery maid, who had spent 6 months being told by the certain people of the world exactly how little she was worth, stood in the candlelight with her father's chin up and a great man's hand around her ruined one, and understood that worth and station were not the same thing, and that the second had just, against all the order of the world, been offered to the first. She said yes, she said it quietly, it was enough. They were married in the spring, in the parish church near the coast where her father had preached, the Duke and Duchess of Maperton standing up for them, and the lime trees on the Maperton Drive coming at last into green leaf 40 miles away. The Duchess kept her keys and her house, and slowly, over many quiet seasons, learned again the steps of the dances she had forgotten, and she and Effie remained. All their long lives, the truest friends either of them had, two frightened women who had once knelt to each other on a cold still-room floor and chosen, against every certainty in the world, to believe in one another's worth. On the evening of her wedding, in the warm, low light of the house at Wendover that was now her own, the new Countess set on the chimney-piece of her sitting room a single worn object she had carried there from a square of sacking. Her father's character reference. Honest in every line and worth, the world had always told her, nothing at all. It had been worth everything. It had been the true cold thing that brought down a forged warm lie in a candle-lit room, the last gift of a gentle ruined man who had taught his daughter the only thing she ever needed to know. She simply set it where she would see it each morning, a plain folded paper bearing a dead parish seal, and beside it she laid the small gray volume of the Cowper that had begun the whole of it, open and face down to keep her place the way a thing is left by someone who means that evening to come back and read on. If Euphemia's long climb out of that cold still room moved you tonight, sit a moment in the quiet of it before you go and carry away the one thing her father gave her, that a person's worth is never the same as a person's station, and that the world's verdict on a woman is not, in the end, the final verdict. Thank you for staying with her to the close.